needs a conductor is a rather dangerous question for anyone in my profession to ask. And yet I am asked that question by people who are extremely erudite and intelligent, and it certainly is a fair question, because here's what they say. They say, look, a professional orchestra can all read music. The music's right there in front of them. The music never changes, it's always the same. And they've probably played it 100 times anyway. So the question is, who needs you to stand there waving your arms about? Let's try a small experiment. Now you watch. Any second now, they'll just go completely to pieces without me. You watch. Any second, this can't go on. They'll just fall apart. You know what's going to happen? Just to get even with me, this orchestra is going to finish this section perfectly without me. Well, what a dirty trick. What I was trying to prove, you see, was that a conductor really is necessary, if for no other reason than to hold things together. But as you could tell just now, they don't need me at all for that reason. They don't need me at all as long as the music is fairly standard repertoire, and it's been rehearsed, and it's more or less in the same meter and in the same rhythms. Then they can get by perfectly well with an occasional nod from the leader. Now, the leader of the orchestra is also the principal violinist. He kind of represents the orchestra, and he traditionally sits nearest the conductor and is supposed to laugh at all his jokes. Yes, good, thank you. But you see, in the old days, actually, it was the leader's job, before the conductor as we know him today, it was the leader's job to hold things together. And the conductor as we know him today is a fairly recent business. At the time of Haydn and Mozart, for instance, the music was directed by the fellow sitting at the keyboard, and he was usually the composer. Now, this is Haydn, down in the bottom left-hand corner of the orchestra, during a performance in the little opera house at Esterházy. Or, the musicians used to be led by a fellow who used a rolled-up sheet of manuscript paper with which he used to bash out the time, and never mind the noise it made. There he is. You don't think I'm serious? I tell you something. In the magnificent court of Louis XIV, there was a composer called Lully. And in those days, he used to thump out the rhythm of the piece he was playing with a huge walking stick, which in those days was a staff of some considerable size. Can I have that, John, please? Yes, thank you very much. Gentlemen, would you, ready? Scrapbook. Thank you, John. Well, that not only is very noisy, but it was very dangerous, because what I'm about to tell you is absolutely true. That Te Deum by Lully, of which we just played, you know, the first few seconds, was written, composed, and conducted by Lully in that fashion to celebrate the recovery of a very serious illness of King Louis XIV. Now, during that very performance, poor Monsieur Lully hit himself very sharply in the foot with that thing, and it developed an infection, and the king got well, and Lully died. Yes, that's one of the first really sick conductor stories, but it's true. Yes, I like stories like that, I'm ashamed to admit. I tell you one I liked, even though it's very parenthetical. There was a newspaper headline here in England, which I've actually seen, it does exist, and it was inadvertently very, very unfortunately phrased, because the newspaper headline said, "Sibelius dies while listening to Malcolm Sargent conduct his Fifth Symphony." Well, never mind. we now use batons of various lengths, and some people, like Tchaikovsky, for instance, use no baton at all. He says he has 10 batons, holds up his 10 fingers. In the 19th century, now, they reached a sort of halfway situation, and that was sitting at the keyboard and waving a stick at the same time. If you were really smart, you had tassels at the end of that baton. Verdi, there on the left, had a stick like a field marshal's baton. You were very unlikely to get an argument from the orchestra when you were bashing around with that thing. Do you know, I tell you something. Leonard Bernstein once said within a lecture, half jokingly and half seriously, that conducting is the only profession in the world where you get paid for having a fit in public. Nice thing to think about. Now, a fair question is, why will an orchestra play terribly well for one conductor and not at all well for another conductor? Well, there is a kind of love-hate relationship between any conductor and any orchestra. And an orchestra will play well or badly for any number of reasons. I'll tell you a few. 1, because they love or hate the conductor. 2, because they adore the music or because they're terrified of it. 3, because that conductor can communicate his wishes to the orchestra well, or he cannot. And 4, and this is my own private theory, I have a feeling that a great orchestra very often plays despite the conductor, because I think that sometimes they are faced with, you know, really a dummy up there on the rostrum, and they've all decided we are going to play brilliantly despite this man. But that's just my theory. So, as far as I'm concerned, the first rule for a conductor is not to impress the audience directly, but to impress the orchestra, which in turn will then impress the audience. But how do you learn to conduct? I mean, how do we all learn our craft? There's a kind of a theory that we go home and practice in front of a mirror, in front of a looking glass. Wouldn't do us much good without an orchestra. I mean, first of all, we'd always be right. Huh? And there's not much use in that. We are actually, conductors are the only people on a concert platform who can never go home and practice their technique. Obviously, we all go home and study scores for days and weeks and months and years, but we can't actually practice our craft. So, where do we learn? Well, these days, you have to conduct anywhere that will have you. A professional orchestra, a semi-professional, amateur, schools, a studio band, anything, anywhere where they will let you up on a rostrum is where you learn. The actual mechanics of conducting, I mean the waving one's hands about, that's what we call stick technique, and that is relatively simple and can be taught quite easily. As a matter of fact, there used to be handbooks, textbooks, with sensational illustrations, and we found one, absolutely legitimate, which has really the damnedest pictures in it, and I really love them. I'm going to show you a couple. Now, for instance, in this handbook, the first one is called Testing the Stick for Straightness. Yes. That's, I've never conducted with a totally bent stick, but that's all right. Here's one called The Starting Position. Note the passion and the poise in that, right? Really inspiring. Fine. This one I like a lot. This one is called Indicating a Forte. Yes. It's also like you're waiting for change from the parking lot. And this one is called Indicating a Piano. Yes, it's indicating that the piano is on your foot and you want it moved. Well, all right. Having mastered all this, you are now more or less ready to do something. And luckily, a lot of music is in very simple duple time, which means that it just has 2 beats to the measure, something like this. Or it's in triple time, which is simply 3 beats to the measure. Of course, it is possible that very often the meter gets subdivided into smaller beats. And here again, I'm going to show you this inimitable and invaluable textbook which has perfect diagrams easily accessible to any child. Let's see one. This is one in a bar. The diagram for one in a bar. That's fairly simple, isn't it? Yes. Let's see one that is called 3 in a bar. A little more complex. Here's 4 in a bar. Yes. It begins to look like one of those diagrams for how to put together Christmas toys. You can never do that. Let's see 6 in a bar. And my very favorite one, 12 in a bar. Yes. Now that is, it looks like an Indian attack. I haven't seen that many arrows since John Wayne stopped conducting. Well, never mind. All right. Now, we are going to play some music for you by the 20th century composer Bela Bartok. This is the finale of his dance suite, and this has a great many varying metric problems. Almost every measure changes, and it not only has all those things that those wonderful arrows were about, but also the odd-numbered ones like 5s and 7s. Thank you. Well, now we've talked a lot, not about conducting so much, as about beating time. And those are two very, very different things. Beating time is only an infinitesimally small part of what conducting is about, and not by any means the most important. So I think we now have to talk about interpretation a bit. Because we talk about, for instance, Klemper's Beethoven, or we talk about Toscanini's Beethoven. But shouldn't we really just be talking about Beethoven's Beethoven? I mean, after all, a composer seems to have put down all the necessary instructions for a performance, and isn't it just the conductor's job to follow those instructions, adding nothing or detracting nothing? But shouldn't there actually be one definitive performance? How far can a conductor actually go by imposing his own interpretation onto the written notes? Because that ultimately, of course, is the conductor's job. Well, you see, you have to start with real basics. Now, there are interpretations, for instance, of such simple everyday words as loud and soft or fast and slow, because very often that's all it says. Now, a conductor has to think about the following. When an 18th century piece of music is marked fast, is that the same kind of fast as a score that was written last year? When it says loud in Handel, is it the same kind of loud as in Stravinsky? When something is marked with one F, in other words, forte, for as gentle an instrument as the flute, and at the same time, the same F, denoting the same loud, is marked under 4 horns, 3 trumpets, and 3 trombones, and a tuba, well, obviously, I mean, something's got to give, and you have to balance all that out, and you have to see who's doing what where. Even tempo is an enormous difficulty. I was handed a score yesterday, I promise you, last night, of a work we're going to do next season, and the work runs about 30 minutes. And at the beginning of the score, it says, not fast. Well, I mean, you know, that's what I call the easy way out for the composer, but I will have to study that and decide what I think, hopefully, he meant by the words, not fast. So you see, it's very, very basic, that kind of interpretation. Now, years ago, when every performance was, as we now say, live, every performance was an event. Because every interpreter could, and every conductor could vary his interpretation of the same piece from night to night. It didn't have to be exactly the same. He could vary the detail, he could vary the overall structure, he could even vary what he thought the inner meaning of the piece was. And that's why I still like live concerts better than anything, because you're allowed to change your mind from time to time. Now, of course, on records, performances are fixed. And that gives you a chance, on the other hand, to buy and compare recordings of the same masterpiece by different composers and see how very basically their interpretation varies. Not subtleties, but the most basic things. Now, for instance, look, this is a metronome, which, as you know, is a mechanical way of setting tempos. And I'm going to show you something. Last year, there were 2 sets of records issued, more or less simultaneously, of the 4 orchestral suites by Bach. And they were recorded by 2 very, very distinguished conductors. One was Otto Klemperer, and the other was Neville Marriner. Now, we took this metronome, and we figured out the metronome markings for each of their records of just the beginning of the first suite. Now, Mr. Klemperer decided that a semiquaver equaled 160 on the metronome. Now, I will show you what that tempo was. We did the same thing to Mr. Mariner's recording, and we found, to our surprise, that he put not a semiquaver, but a quaver at 152. In other words, virtually exactly double that tempo. Now, I find that really truly interesting, that there are two distinguished conductors looking at a masterpiece, and they can be that divergent on as basic a thing as just the tempo. Now, think of how interpretively they must differ on real subtleties if they start off from square one that divergently. Now, there actually were two schools of thought about conducting. The first conductor, as we know him, in other words, a man who stands in front of an orchestra and, if you like, imposes his will on an orchestra, was Mendelssohn. So, in other words, it was about, 150 years ago. Now, his school of thought is simply that a conductor's job, his responsibility was to do exactly what the composer had on the printed page, adding nothing and detracting nothing. The other school was Wagner. Wagner was a bit more passionate about conducting because he felt that he would give the conductor carte blanche to do whatever the conductor felt was correct in terms of tempo, fluctuations of tempo, dynamics, phrasing, even to the point of occasionally touching up the orchestration and changing it. Sometimes I'm asked, which of those two widely divergent schools I belong to, and I guess I couldn't really answer that one way or the other. I suppose that, on the theory that maybe there really is a hereafter, I would hate to run into Beethoven and have him be furious with me, but, well, anyway, at a concert, which is, by the way, not nearly as important as a rehearsal, but we'll get into that a little later. At a concert, a conductor's problems very often start before the first note of the music begins. Because you must remember that a concert is some kind of theatrical experience. Here's 106 people usually dressed like penguins, and it's a rather formal occasion, and a conductor should make a dignified entrance of some kind. Now, I remember very well the very first time I conducted the Philadelphia Orchestra. Now, the Philadelphia Orchestra is one of the very, very greatest orchestras in the world, and so I was in the wings, both elated and very frightened. And finally, the man said, "Okay, maestro, go." And I walked out on the stage, and the applause started, and I felt very, very happy and eager to get on with it. So I walked briskly to center stage and misjudged the height of the rostrum, and in full evening kit, went flat on my face across the rostrum, but like a circus clown, just bam, like that. Well, the orchestra adored it, They thought it was by far the best part of the concert. And so I picked myself up, and suddenly through my head went Freud's maxim, there are no accidents. But I did feel that once I gave a downbeat and off we went into Mahler, that at least for that night, I had got all my problems over with before the music had started. But let's assume that you've made it to the rostrum without actually breaking your neck, and you are now more or less ready to start. Lights are dimmed, and it's now or never. Now, you see, you come to a quite serious moment of conducting, because I promise you, there is only one split second which is the correct moment to start a piece of music. And I can't really explain that, but if you wait a split second too long, or if you jump the cue and do it a split second too early, that particular and peculiar magic that happens at the beginning of a piece can be destroyed. And you learn that, not in the conservatory, you just learn that kind of timing, that feeling, as you conduct more and more. Of course, that's a kind of a mysterious problem about starting. There is a very practical one. Some pieces are just difficult to start, technically, for the orchestra and for the conductor. An infamous one, a notorious piece, is Richard Strauss's tone poem, Don Juan. Now, let me just play you the beginning of this. Sounds simple enough. But I absolutely promise you that that very beginning has caused more disasters and more chaotic beginnings than anything you can think of, because Strauss was really wicked when he wrote that. First of all, it doesn't start on a proper downbeat. Then it's fiendishly difficult, especially for the strings, right away. And it has just been a famous jumble. There's a very distinguished colleague of mine who solved this problem. He was really worried about that piece, and he solved it in the most ingenious way. Now, I grant you that it was a cheat, but it was sensational. I'm going to show it to you. Now, pretend with me that I am this distinguished conductor. I will get off the rostrum and get back on to start this piece again, but you must do me a favor. Pretend along with me that I am this distinguished man and applaud like mad. Yes, please? See, we get 2 prizes for that, because while you were applauding, you didn't hear how the beginning was, and while we were playing, we had no idea how it was because we couldn't hear anything but the applause. And once that stopped, we were already safely into bar 3, and no one hurt. Well, anyway, I admired him for the idea. Incidentally, although the music of Strauss is extremely extrovert and highly supercharged and romantic, his thoughts on being a conductor, and he was one of the world's most renowned conductors, apart from being a great composer, his thoughts on conducting were eminently practical. Now, in a book which I own and which I treasure, he set down some, I think, a dozen or 15 rules, advice to young conductors. I won't bore you with all of them, but there are 3 that I really truly adore, and I'll read them to you. 1, advice to young conductors. 1, you should never perspire when you conduct. Only the audience should get warm. 2, this one I do love. Never smile encouragingly at the brass. Sorry. And 3, the thumb of the left hand of the conductor must never leave the pocket of his waistcoat. I mean, I don't even have a jacket on, so I can't be much. But, well, a long time ago, when I was a student, I studied with a very, very great conductor, Pierre Monteux, who used to be, in point of fact, the principal conductor of this very orchestra. But I studied with him in America, and he said something to me once that I've never forgotten. He stopped me once while I was conducting, when I was a student of his, and he said, "May I ask you something? Do you think, at this particular moment in the piece, that the orchestra is playing very well?" And I said yes, that I thought they were indeed playing very well. And he said, "Well, so do I, so don't get in their way." Now, that was lovely advice, and I've never forgotten it. There are many moments where that is eminently applicable. For instance, when an orchestra abounds with great soloists, such as this orchestra does, it is foolishness to inflict your own conducting and every nuance, every fluctuation on them. You should just let them play. A piece that has lots of these kind of solo passages in it is Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherazade. Now let us just play you a few minutes of that, and hopefully I can remember my old master's advice. What is difficult for people to imagine sometimes is that a conductor can read a score of music the same way as he can read a book. He must be able to hear exactly what is printed on that page, just in his head, without a sound going on. Now, that is not that much of a trick. It's simply a part of the profession that you learn. But he must be able to hear not only what's on the page, but he must be able to see instantly what is important, how will it sound, what are the different elements, which one is more important than the other, what can be brought out, what must be kind of tucked into the rest. I mean, a conductor should know the capacity and the range of each instrument. He should know its strengths and its weaknesses. He should know where it sounds brilliant and where it sounds dull. He should know what's difficult to play on each instrument and what is easy. And he should be able to ask for and produce different shadings of sound from each instrument in the orchestra. But it certainly isn't necessary to play each one. It's a staggering thought. I'm glad it isn't necessary. Well, you see, you have to know what the player's problems are, both technically and personally. That it applies not just to musical problems, but to personal ones as well. Do you remember I told you that rehearsals are infinitely more important than concerts in many ways? Because, you see, the concert is only a representation of all the work that's already been done at the rehearsal. At a rehearsal, that is where the work really gets done. That's where the interpretation is molded and discussed, and that is where the parts are marked, and where the bowings are made, and where everything is all set. I have a story that I'll tell you that refers to Maestro Zell and myself, because it dates back to the days when I was a pianist, and not a conductor yet, and I was traveling around as a pianist, and there was an idea that I should play the Richard Strauss Burlesque for piano and orchestra with George Zell, who was a great Strauss expert. So he asked me to come to his hotel suite in Los Angeles, California at the time. And I went up, and he greeted me. He was very, very nice, very formal man, very correct. You know, he would never have dressed like this, could have. Well, all right. Anyway, we discussed the burlesque for a while, the piece I was to play. And then he said, okay, fine, will you play it for me? And I was happy to get the agony of the conversation over with and eager to play. And I looked round for the piano, and he said, no, I have no piano in the hotel, but it's perfectly all right. I know the piece very well. Play it on the table. This is true, I promise. So feeling like really one of the biggest idiots in life, you know, I mean, I sat down and started thumping away on this tabletop, you see. And after 5 seconds, Maestro Zell stopped me and he said, it's much too slow. And at that point, I'd kind of, you know, I was a rude young man, I suppose, and I said, well, you see, it's too slow because I'm not familiar with your table. I said, if at home on my own dining room table, I just fly through it. So he said, that's not funny, young man, and threw me out. Anyway, I never played that concert. I never did. But he was a very, very great man. I'll tell you one other story. And that is, again, I was a pianist, and I was playing in America with a very distinguished conductor. This time I won't tell you who it is. But anyway, we played a Prokofiev concerto, and it was over, and there was happily quite some applause, and the two of us took our bows and went off, and I was ready to go back on with the conductor, and he said, no. I mean, you go out alone. You deserve a bow all alone. Just don't bother about me. Just go on out. So I did. I mean, you know, I went out and I took a quick bow, and I went back, and as I came off the stage and hit the wings, he grabbed my wrist in an absolutely iron-like grip, and he said, okay, now drag me out. And please don't start guessing games as to who that was, because I won't tell you anyway. Well, now look. So far, I've told you stories about conducting and some facts and some impressions about being a conductor. But I think we have to get down to the intangibles of being a conductor, because they're the most important and the least possible to really explain logically. Do you remember I told you about that split second that was the only correct split second of starting a piece? Well, that doesn't apply just to the first note of a piece. It applies to every note in the work. The timing and the spacing of one note to the next note, one phrase to the next phrase, one idea to the next idea, one movement to the next. It all has to be placed into that kind of time continuum, because that's what music's all about. kind of time and space. And it is the conductor's responsibility to do his best to make sure that each phrase, each note follows the next with the correct amount of time, that the piece has passion when it's supposed to, and relaxation when it's supposed to, and devotion when it has to, and excitement when it has to. And at the same time that he's concentrating on all these details, he must never neglect the larger sense of the music, the architecture, the grand plan, if you like, the idea behind it, the reason the composer bothered to write all that music has to become apparent. And that is what the conductor must try to communicate to the orchestra. You see, well, when you read a book, you can always turn back a few pages and reread something. If you're looking at a painting, you can either stand back and view the whole thing at once, or you can go up and examine details. But at a performance, as the notes go by, they're gone forever. There's no second look, there's no second listen. You have to really make sure that both detail and the large plan are becoming apparent to an orchestra and therefore to the audience at one and the same time. And that's what you don't learn at a conservatory or in a school. And it's difficult. But when a conductor can communicate his love for the music to the orchestra, and the orchestra has love for the music, and those two really fuse, then you get a lovely and rare representation of that music. And it doesn't happen all the time, but I promise it's worth trying for every time. Now, all that talking is over, and we're actually going to play something from beginning to end. We're going to play for you the last movement of the Tchaikovsky Fifth Symphony, but I also hope you don't take me at my word, and I hope you don't expect the definitive performance from me at this point. Also, one last thing that I wanted to say. I really fervently believe and am sure that the image of the great maestro conductor has had it. It doesn't work anymore. Nobody believes in it. It isn't practical, it isn't necessary. And I'm sure that no matter which one of my colleagues you would ask, they would all agree with that. But next time, if ever, you ask a conductor for an autograph, or you look one straight in the eye, you can be sure that beneath that whole self-effacing, I'm just one of the boys, just a tool of the gods attitude, lurks a heart of almost pure vanity. Good night.